You know, you have to think, how do you evaluate someone's worth in the society? Is it will based off of things that you believe will happen in the future? Or is it based off of things that will have already happened? Or is it based off of things that will presently are occurring? How do you value work in a society of will? Not just the individual, but will what the individual provides to you, the larger based society. This is will a crucial question that we gotta make a determination in this season. And seasons aren't only 1 year long or 2 years long. Seasons can last generations. Seasons can last 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. You know, how do you measure worth? Well, in America, because we live in a capitalistic system, we measure worth by what we're able to labor. And when our labor is rewarded through capital, through monetary money. Now, that's not to say that everybody has been treated with certain levels of equality in our society. No. But still, that's our metric that we use. You know, people don't generally say what they like or talk about themselves. Their whole essence, their whole summation of their existence is wrapped up in what their position is, you know, what their title or place in the capitalistic system is. That's how it works in capitalism. You know, the American society, you can argue whether it's good or bad, or indifferent. Those are crucial philosophical arguments to be had. But that's not what I want to argue. I want to argue empirical truths. And not necessarily argue, but just state for the record what they are. You know, in 1619, something that we're all, privy to now, and soon more so in November. You know, during that time, there were individuals that came to this country, predominantly, African in nature. They came against their will, and large portions of the individuals who were enslaved were actually men, were individuals who identified as being men. There was a smaller number of individuals who came in those slave ships that were women. Now, to put that in comparison, we had always had slavery on our planet. But generally speaking, when people took slaves, they wanted more women and girls than they did men and boys. But not the American society. You see, it already had a plan in place as to, what the enslaved would do, what their purpose was. And that's what we're getting to. The role of, black women in the American society from 1619 to 2021. You know, we're debating whether to discuss any of this in the public, whether it be schools, whether it be college campuses, whether it be cafes, whether it be your neighborhood church, whether it be in Congress or the United States Senate, even the White House. We're debating whether to discuss these things on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And well, debates are vital. Debates are good. It should happen in a free and civil society. Debate is what you want to occur. But well, there comes a time for debate and discussion. But there's also a time for action. We'll talk about the debate and then the actions that should happen. Well, the debate is central. The debate is well crucial. On one side, a certain percentage of Americans, who knows how large or how small, they believe that this debate is not crucial. This discussion is not, well, warranted or needed. Because, well, in their mind, the American society works. And, well, that might be true. That might be false. But, well, we know it hasn't worked for black women in America. No. The experiment, the American society has never worked for black women. And that's something that, well, a lot of people don't want to come to terms with. You know, it's an inconvenient truth. And, well, you're asking purple people out. How can you say these things? Well, we can say these things because we can back it up with, well, facts, evidence. You know, such thing still does exist. Even in a world where everyone believes in, well, the next conspiracy theory, there are still some truths that, well, are evident and empirical. In 1619, you didn't want to be an African woman. Not an African slave. No. That was the last thing you wanted to be. First, you were on a ship, dark and cold, with strangers, men, who you did not know, who weren't necessarily, well, related to you. Some were, some weren't. But, well, the treatment by those individuals was abhorrent. But that was sort of kind of forced upon, and due to a whole host of other factors. But the treatment also of the subjugator, you know, that was also abhorrent. So we go to 1619. Nothing good happening if you're an African or black woman. And then we move forward. We have, well, in 1789, the nation finally, well, sort of kind of finally done fighting this war with England. At that time, you see, America was fighting for its independence from the monarchy, from Great Britain. And so, by 1789, the Declaration of Independence was, well, crafted and written. It was set in stone that America would be a new nation, a colonial settlement, you know, on indigenous land. But before we get to rehash that, we do have to be fair to history, even with that. The indigenous people, also women of color, were traumatized and brutalized by, well, the colonists. And not just that, but there were also treaties signed. Treaties that never were abided by. And, well, you know, the rest is sort of kind of history. Now, the new slaves that came to America were focusing on the black women because, well, in our estimation and opinion, those have been the individuals most marginalized and oppressed in American society. Nobody can argue otherwise. I'll explain why. You know, they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We'll stop there. The rest is just blah, blah, blah. Because, well, it doesn't mention women at all. And, well, it certainly didn't mention anything about black women. Because they weren't even viewed as being women. So, from 1789, you didn't have any rights as a black woman. No. Your main priority and focus in the American experiment at that point in time was to be a breeder. You see, you needed to have more slaves working in the South. And, well, in other industries too that were very labor inducive. And you didn't have any rights then. So we move forward now to the 1800s. Nothing's really changed. Still abhorrent conditions. Still inhumane treatment. Still being used as, well, a breeder vessel to create new slaves. And, well, then you finally get to 1861. The thing everybody talks about. The Civil War. The first American Civil War, which lasted 4 years. You see, this war was fought to end the institution of slavery in America. Now, the institution of slavery in America came to, well, an abrupt end as the story is told to us. But now, based off of actually properly learning history, we realize that the institution of slavery in America never actually really came to an end. No, the fabric of the institution of slavery just changed. Black women still had no rights at this point in time. Even after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, black women still, well, could not represent themselves, could not vote for representation, could not own property. None of these things, none of these privileges the men were allowed to have. And, well, at the tail end of it, a limited number of black men were allowed to have, were black women given. Now, we get to the 19th century, 1920, and, well, when you know, the 19th Amendment is finally passed, and women finally have the right to, well, represent themselves, and, well, vote for the representation that they think best suits their needs. That's what we're told in school anyway. But, well, that also is not true. You see, white women were given the right to vote, not black women. Black women wouldn't get or garner the right to vote to the Civil Rights Act of 1965 passage. So what that means is, black women in the United States of America have only been able to vote freely for their representation for 55 years in America under the American experiment. Now, we all have relatives and family members that are far older than 55 years of age. If they happen to be black, they weren't able to vote when they were 18. They weren't able to own property when they were 18. They weren't able to, well, acquire and amass generational wealth when they were 18. So, this whole notion or argument that we won't even reflect on privilege and privilege of certain classes and groups in this country because, well, it makes people feel uncomfortable. The ultimate feeling of uncomfortability is, generally speaking, when you're not allowed to participate in a system that says you are a citizen. I would imagine that was very uncomfortable. You know, why are we talking about the role of black women in America? does that have to do with present day? Quite a bit. We'll talk about that in a moment. But finally, black women have the right to vote. Have the right to be, well, represented. Now, you're thinking, okay, that's the end of the story. Why is it still, well, something else that needs to be said and done? Because just because you give somebody the right to vote, the right to have representation, doesn't mean, well, you solve the problem of inequality. You see, other people had that right, that privilege for centuries by that time. And well, other people had it decades before. So it's sort of kind of like doing a race, track and field. And well, everybody's lined up. And well, they say on your mark, set, go. And well, one person is told, when we say go, you have to wait till, well, the other runners are halfway around the track, and then you can start running. And well, if you catch up, you catch up. If you don't catch up, then well, it's really your fault, because well, you didn't run fast enough to catch up. That's sort of kind of what we tell, well, black women in our society. The real reason you're not doing well in this society is because, well, you're not applying yourself the same way as other people are. Not mentioning the fact that, well, there's been ample time for other people to, well, have that privilege of doing just that. We called for last year, and we still do, restitution through forms of, well, reparations for indigenous and black women in America. We said that should happen immediately, and it should have. And if we had, well, real legislatures. I'm not saying that all the people doing our legislative work are bad people. Many are good people. But there's a substantial amount of people who are legislators elected across our country who are not doing anything to progress and move this country forward. Instead, they want to go backwards and will think that making something what it once was again would be a noble and good idea. Sheer insanity, if you ask us. Well, that was then. This is now your thinking. We now have a vice president who identifies as being an African American woman. We have Oprah Winfrey, who's a billionaire. We have Rihanna, who's a billionaire. Everybody loves Beyonce and Meg Thee Stallion. Cardi B is chart topping. Doja Cat. We have, well, plenty of black women online that have huge followings and platforms. All is right now. This is an old, stale, ignorant argument. And this argument is generally made by people who, well, don't remember movement and memory in history. You've always had triumphant individuals, people in a group that's oppressed and marginalized, that will, through sheer triumph of the soul and spirit, escalate and soar above others. That doesn't mean that the larger group that's, well, being oppressed can do that or is allowed to do those things. Oftentimes in systems of oppression, you need to find, well, one or two individuals or a handful of individuals that are, well, you're oppressing, but then you oppress in a different way. It could be through a whole host of things. Have you seen Hidden Figures? The movie. It's a very popular movie. It tells the role of, well, 4 African American women who work for NASA, who are brilliant mathematicians, Nobody would have got to the moon had it not been for those African American women. Yet, in American society, they were hidden figures for, well, decades. And then the story finally came out. But not after Neil Armstrong lied. You know, he's famous for saying, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He did more to invisibilize those women than anything else, even after Hidden Figures, even after congressional gold medals. Had it not been for black women, no man would have been, well, taking any steps anywhere near the moon. Shooting, well, it had been one small step for women, one giant leap for womankind. No, you would have never heard a male actually be honest and credit the individuals who were responsible for that. And it took, well, an ungrateful nation forever to get around to telling the American citizenry who was really truly responsible for that endeavor. This November, there's a book that's been published that will be released entitled 1619, written by a black woman by the name of Nicole Hannah Jones. This book has caused, well, quite the controversy. Why? Well, because it tells a story a different way. A way that, well, hasn't been told or explained or shared before. And it puts, well, voices who have been marginalized and oppressed in a different light. And, well, when you're not used to sharing alternative stories, because, well, the story that you've concocted is the one that everybody has to go along with, then trouble ensues. Now, conservative parents all across America have gone to their local school boards demanding that the book not be, well, even in a classroom, let alone be taught from or, well, looked upon by their children's eyes. Now, why in 2021 would parents, grown adults, be so terrified of a book that offers a different alternative to the story, well, that they were given? Could it be the fact that, well, the person who's written the book is amplifying a different voice than, well, what's being amplified in America? Maybe that's a possibility. Could it be that there's truths, many truths in the book that are uncomfortable and, well, unwanting to be discussed? Perhaps that's the case as well. But could it be that the voice that's amplifying these things is being critical to, well, the nation that, well, didn't look so kindly upon that individual and those people when they first were forced to come to this nation? That could be a possibility too. You know, we have to examine all possibilities here as to why there's so much controversy with this book, 1619. We've gone back to banning books. I don't think that that's an appropriate response in a debate or discussion to when you don't want to discuss something. Just try to, well, make it go away and use whatever subversive means to do so. You know, a privileged elite, mostly white school in Massachusetts had invited Nicole Hannah Jones recently to speak for Black History Month to students who were interested in, well, hearing what she had to say. But the school president and the board rescinded their invitation. Well, they did it without really properly notifying the person that they had invited through the correct means and channels. Okay, they apologized for that. I don't know whether that apology should be accepted or declined. I'm not the person that that was done to. But the reason they say they canceled it was, it would create too much distraction. It would create an unsafe environment. So here's what we've been told in 2021 thus far. That a discussion about truths, empirical truths, that were the pillars that uplifted this empire, those cannot be shared in the public discourse because, it would lead to violence. As though black women have not experienced violence at the hands of, white supremacy. 4 little black girls were killed in a church when a white supremacist planted a bomb and detonated it. Terrorism isn't new to black women in America. Pretty much all the founding fathers of this nation owned slaves. That's commonly known. Maybe it was not so commonly known. It's all of them, had their issues in terms of, violating their slaves' bodily autonomy. African and black women were repeatedly, violated by their subjugators. We know this. This is history. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is just one case, this being evident and apparent. But there's multiple cases. This 2021. Nobody wants to discuss these kinds of things. Not in the public. Not in private. You just want to keep moseying along like nothing is happening. And I would say that's fine. But it really isn't. It's really detrimental. And it really could bring about the end of an empire. You see, pillars are foundations that hold up a building. Without the pillars, the foundational structure collapses and crumbles. November of this year, 2021, we have a book, the 1619 Project. It creates and gives a definitive look at the American experience through the lens of, the people who were most oppressed by the American experience. And we can't do any critical analysis. And if we can't do any critical analysis of that, then we can determine, solutions to solve it. I say restitution through reparations is one way. That won't be the only way. You have to have, representation and amplification. Whose voices this season get amplified? You gotta think. Just put yourself in, somebody's shoes for a moment, hypothetically. You're in a room, and you all do the same job. And you've been working at the company for 20 years. And every time you have a meeting, you never get called on. And you're definitely not allowed to speak. Now wait a minute. You've been working at this company for 20 years. You never get called on. and you're not allowed to speak. Can you think of all the problems that might occur? Well, kind of like what's happening in the United States. You see, black women have not been allowed to speak. And well, this season, we have sort of kind of made a consensus as well citizens that we were going to amplify marginalized and oppressed voices as part of a broad-based social equity lens approach that we were taking to repair harm, real harm that had been done for centuries in this country. Well, apparently some of the signers of that agreement never signed it. No, they just pretended that they were for it. But they weren't really for it. They were against it. And now that they're having to, well, actually voice whether they're in support or against, you're seeing what they're doing. They're violently saying that they're against it. No, marginalized and oppressed people's voices shouldn't be amplified this season. The same old voices and rhetoric, that should continue to be amplified. You know, a new face, but the same rhetoric. Those things should be amplified. And we passionately disagree. And well, that's why we should have a, well, legitimate and real debate. You can see part 1 over on YouTube. Only because IG didn't allow part 1 to be posted. It wasn't the case that, well, we didn't want you to see part 1. We did. But you know, these algorithms, these platforms, you have to think, they serve a purpose in a white supremacist run system too. You gotta think, do they amplify the voices of black women? Or do they not amplify the voices of black women? And well, do the voices that they amplify represent a large swath of the marginalized and oppressed of black women in our society? Think about those questions. You know, this season we should amplify voices of black women. And I was listening to, well, someone who identifies as being a black woman, the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. You know, she has some interesting points about critical race theory and, well, public education. And she made a point to mention that, well, we shouldn't make white children feel uncomfortable. And we should find a way to empower black children to learn about the history of this country. Now, it's one thing to suggest, well, what you should be able to do or what you want to do. But in practicality, when you actually do something, well, that requires action. And that requires, well, in the case of education, a curriculum. There's a curriculum. It's just that, well, it doesn't go over with everybody in every community. No curriculum ever would. And I think that's the whole point of this. You see, very fundamentalist conservative parents have always had an issue with public education. They've always thought that public education was too liberal. They protested in the 60s about public education because, well, they thought that people were being radicalized to join the civil rights movement. You know, there were people against, well, segregation. And then there were people who were violently in support of segregation. And, well, they came to restaurants to harass black people. They did all kinds of horrible things to black people in public spaces that weren't desegregated. And that's eerily reminding us of what's happening in these school board meetings. What's happening to, well, teachers who are being threatened. And, well, politicians and elected office holders were being threatened as well. You know, January 6th, the storming of the nation's capital, because, well, a dictatorial, narcissistic, insane lunatic lost an election. That's a result of, well, a backlash, not getting your way. And we've seen that before too in this country. During the civil rights era, there was violence, rampant violence, all across America because, well, black people were advocating for the right to vote. And now in 2021, we're seeing the South, after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 be passed, we're seeing southern states en masse trying to chip away and once again take away the right to vote from black American citizens. To the point where the United States government is strongly considering carving out a procedural motion in the Senate called the filibuster to nationalize and have standards across the board for how elections are run and governed. This is needed because, well, left to people's old vices, people will, well, revert back to what they were, which is, well, what they always have been, racist in this country. You know, if you don't teach history, if you don't teach tolerance, you get intolerance and you get ignorance. You get things like Candace Reed, dressing up like an indigenous person, doing things that indigenous people never did on any parts of their land, based solely out of ignorance. You get people like Candace Owens who say, well, I can think of 100 things that really are adverse to the black community, but white supremacy wouldn't make that list of 100 things. When in actuality, everything that adversely impacts the African American community can be attributed to, well, white supremacy. You know, we ought to amplify Condoleezza Rice's voice. Even if I personally don't agree with her viewpoints, we ought to amplify Candace Owens' viewpoint. Even if I personally don't agree with them, we ought to amplify Angela Rye. We ought to amplify Whoopi Goldberg, Tiffany Cross, Jamil Hill. You know, we ought to amplify black women this season because, well, we've had the amplification of voices for so long that, well, those who are marginalized and oppressed, they never had a voice. You can't say, well, you gotta catch up to the runners. No, you just gotta start the race over again. You gotta do it right, the proper way. And, well, you say you can't, well, pick up spilled milk. And that's true, you can't pick up spilled milk. But, well, you gotta change the way the system works, the whole foundational structure of it. And you definitely gotta empower and amplify voices that never were or never have been. That's the only way to really have a liberty and justice for all. Because just saying liberty and justice for all, when we know it's really not for everyone, well, that does a disservice to the words. It does a disservice to the nation. And it does a disservice, well, to the people who have to live in the nation. You know, this November, I'm amplifying voices that haven't been amplified before. I'm picking, well, winners and losers. Because that's what happens in America. It always happens in America. People pick winners and losers. It's just the fact that, well, the loser has always been black women in American society. And that era, that Neanderthal thinking, that has to end. And it has to end with this generation. And it's good that we have the resources to end it. But now we have to have the action to, well, bring it about. I think the younger generation is willing to do it. I think there's many people, though, that are old and set in their ways and not willing to do it. And they're going to put up a mighty fight against it. Well, we have to stand firm and steadfast in our beliefs too. And well, if need be, we have to put up a fight back against it, against intolerance, against hatred, against bigotry, and against, well, wanting to continue the marginalization and oppression of people by not amplifying their voice and choosing to only amplify voices that, well, condone and agree with the subjugation continuing. We can't have that this season. So this November, I'm uplifting the voice of Nicole Hannah Jones. I've already purchased 1619. I look forward to reading, to discussing, to actually implementing, and to actually, well, finally having our nation live up to being a more perfect union. That can't happen without the amplification and actions necessary to make black women, well, actually whole, to heal black women for what occurred in this country. 1619 is a resource. The rest of us is citizenry. We're the action. We have to do our part as an active and well-formed citizenry. I have no doubt that we will this season. But we'll have some adversities that we'll have to face. Some difficulty, uncomfortability. Well, that's part of the course. We're Americans. When we're faced with adversity, we persevere. And I have no doubt that we'll continue to persevere through this dark time in our history. Thank you.